This is Anthony of Philosophy Cafe, where we visit the writings in philosophy that you may have or have not read with the purpose of arriving at new questions, thoughts, and ideas on the spot in an unbounded and unapologetic way. You can think of it as an audiobook/podcast experience all in one, so feel free to join me in the reading and reevaluation of these timeless concepts that must evolve as we do. This is for all of you out there that are abstractly curious and don't even know why. All right, today we're going to look at a passage from Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. He is definitely quite the renowned writer if you are or are not familiar with him. He had won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957, and Myth of Sisyphus is definitely one of those top tier works that I think all should visit, whether you're interested in philosophy or not. This is very interesting. Camus is very well known to be an absurdist, and in absurdism, it's sort of a complementary philosophy to nihilism, where both of them state that there is no meaning to life. However, with absurdism, there is some sort of remedy to that situation because we need to consider while reading his work, and nihilists or absurdists alike, that nihilism is not necessarily a philosophical solution. It's actually pointing to a philosophical problem. And the remedy to that in Camus' work is that, okay, if we do make the claim and we accept that there is no inherent meaning to life, at least in the way that we would like to perceive it, there is some notion that we can choose our meaning. And this is kind of a way to rectify that. And he goes into quite intense detail in this book here, The Myth of Sisyphus. And you may be familiar with the quote of, or the concept of questioning if Sisyphus is happy, if you're familiar with the dialogue or the allegory of Sisyphus rolling a boulder up a hill eternally, and it keeps dropping every time he gets to the hill. Is he happy? Has he accepted his fate? Is there a proportionality between acceptance and happiness? And it's an absurd question, but an interesting one nonetheless. But I would like to dive straight in. And another thought that I would like us to keep in mind is, I think this is very interesting, being that it was written a few decades ago now. This was kind of like the last stance in philosophy, the last major pillar or the last flag that was planted in philosophy. I'm curious what you think about that. There's seldom been many works in philosophy for the sake of philosophy since, so it's really cool to look back and look at this as like a contemporary type of work, but also urge I would say, I guess, also encourage the opportunity for there to be more works in this world regarding philosophy and more contemplations, because like I said, even though nihilism is not necessarily a solution, it's a problem. Just because absurdism attempts to rectify that does not mean that we have solved it in its entirety, because there's still so many questions around really why we have this affinity to meaning in the first place, if the way that we look through the lens of the world is solely through meaning, almost like it's the source of all our problems and all our solutions, and it's an inescapable loop. So to just rid meaning as a facet that we don't need to look at anymore, I think is definitely is negligible in many ways, but also we've been known to be in some sort of meaning crisis. We definitely we find purpose in the things that we attach ourselves to, right? So I think there's a lot of merit in still exploring these questions, but I will let Camus do the rest, and we're going to start off with a passage on page 10 here, and this one's titled Absurd Walls. So let's dive in. Like great works, deep feelings always mean more than they are conscious of saying. The regularity of an impulse or repulsion in a soul is encountered again in habits of doing or thinking, is reproduced in consequences of which the soul itself knows nothing. Great feelings take with them their own universe, splendid or abject. They light up with their passion an exclusive world in which they recognize their climate. There is a universe of jealousy, of ambition, of selfishness, or of generosity. A universe, in other words, a metaphysic and an attitude of mind. What is true of already specialized feelings will be even more so of emotions, basically as indeterminate, simultaneously as vague and as definite, as remote and as present as those furnished us by beauty or aroused by absurdity. Okay, very interesting first portion of the work here regarding absurd walls. So it seems like what he's initially getting at is this concept of soul to us is actually very unfamiliar. No matter how much that we place reverence on it, or no matter how much we refer to it itself, it's still very unfamiliar to us. It's this unfamiliar, ethereal territory we don't know how to define, we don't know how to explain, but we have these impulses towards the soul. We have this affinity to describe that, or to feel like a soul does exist within us that's navigating who we are, our decisions, our feelings, and our emotions, all things considered, right? But we just can't completely grasp it because of its immaterial, because of its, as he mentions, this metaphysic concept here. And we can't really recognize its climate. We don't understand its environment. We don't understand what it takes to nurture such a soul. And it's really interesting because when you look later into this work, he kind of pokes a hole at the concept of the soul as also being in the realm of the absurd itself, right? That it's this strangeness to life. This is a topic and concept I think we should keep in mind as well. So it's almost as if our feelings are operating as their own beings at this point, that they're independent of the awareness that recognize them. So remember, very interestingly so, as humans, we seem to be among the only creatures that are able to do this, but we can consider our own thinking. We can think of our own thinking, and simultaneously we're able to think or become aware of our own feelings as well, right? This is probably somewhere many arguments have arisen where consciousness is located, if you may, and or where we can at least expect to simulate some sort of consciousness, is the fact that you can be aware of your feelings, and we can recognize these feelings, but these feelings seem to take a life of their own, and because they seem to respond to the sensitive motion, let's say, of the soul, to the direction, to the orientation of the soul, and that strangeness seems to be something very absurd. It seems to be where the absurd lays, without actually claiming what the absurd is, right? And this is something also I think is very important to keep in mind, especially because this is at an earlier portion of this book here, is that Camus does not necessarily describe or define the absurd explicitly, but he tries to toggle around it by approximating the strangeness, this feeling, this relationship that we have with our own soul, and not understanding how to define it. So that's definitely like a starting point, if you may. So it seems to be that it's very interesting, because it appears to be that when awareness of your own soul recognizes itself without the texture of its feelings, it's also recognizing the absurd, because we recognize our soul through our feelings. It's kind of like when you talk about being intuitive, you feel like you're at one with yourself, or you feel like you're aligned with yourself. That's because your thoughts and your feelings are aligned. But what happens when you recognize that same soul, or at least the concept of the soul, without those feelings? It's this strangeness, it's this void, it feels empty. It's like, whoa, I understand that I do exist, that there is this ethereal soul, whatever that may be, something outside of myself or within myself, but it's not being paired with any familiar feelings or emotions. And that's that strangeness. That's where these contemplations almost start to come up, like, what am I? What is life? And I think that's what he's trying to highlight and illustrate here, is that this absurdity, the questions of absurdity, start to arise when we experience our own soul without the feelings that necessarily accompany it. And at the last portion here, he mentions, I'll just repeat again, simultaneously as vague and as definite, as remote and as present as those furnished us by beauty or aroused by absurdity. So right off the bat there, my goodness, there's an explicit dichotomy between beauty and absurdity. And I'm curious why that is. It's almost as if beauty seems much more apparent to us. Beauty is much more striking by way of feeling, and much more explicit based on how we experience beauty. For example, when you know something is beautiful to you, you would know it right away. Experiencing a flower or looking up at the stars, it's that awestruck that you experience, that you feel. Whereas absurdity is much more strange. It's much more obscure. And I suppose that's where that dichotomy is coming from. Would love to know what you think about that. However, it seems to be that he's very clear on making that difference, and that difference lays in our experience of beauty and absurdity. So let's keep that going forward here. So moving on. At any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike any man in the face. As it is in the distressing nudity, in its light without effulgence, it is elusive, but that very difficulty deserves reflection. It is probably true that a man remains forever unknown to us, and that there is in him something irreducible that escapes us. But practically, I know men and recognize them by their behavior, by the totality of their deeds, by the consequences caused in life by their presence. Likewise, all those irrational feelings which offer no purchase to analysis, I can define them practically, appreciate them practically, by gathering together the sum of their consequences in the domain of the intelligence, by seizing and noting all their aspects, by outlining their universe. It is certain that apparently, though I have seen the same actor 100 times, I shall not for that reason know him any better personally. Yet if I add up the heroes he has personified, and if I say that I know him a little better at the 100th character counted off, this will be felt to contain an element of truth. For this apparent paradox is also an apologue. There is no morale to it. It teaches that a man defines himself by his make-believe as well by his sincere impulses. There is thus a lower key of feelings, inaccessible in the heart, but partially disclosed by the acts they imply and the attitudes of mind they assume. Wow. Just a quick note there. What a brilliant writer. Just such an incredible way to illustrate the feelings that we have difficulty articulating, but are so explicit to us by. It's almost like we inherently understand these concepts, but we just don't know how to completely define them. And I think he's just done such a wonderful job without defining them completely, without I guess placing parameters around them, but by talking about how he can understand someone at the 100th character counted off because of their make-believe is very fascinating, because it's true, our orientation is always directed by something that's almost outside of us, even though you can have all these debates regarding free will and our ability to make choices and to have this inherent manifestation come out of us as part of who we really are. At the end of the day, it seems to be that we need to emulate something outside of us, which grants us some sort of direction, right? And this thing, it seems to be make-believe. It seems to be characteristic of heroism, let's say, right? And that's what gives us a credence. That's what gives us encouragement to move forward and actually take action at the end of the day. And I think that that's what he's highlighting here. And noticing that there's a truth in this, even though it's paradoxical, because it's very difficult to understand someone in their entirety just by the immediate choices they're making or their impulses, as he refers to. You can actually develop a better understanding of them if you understand their orientation and what the story they tell themselves are, or the make-believe that they believe in. What's the illusion? What's the story that they're believing in that actually allows them to orient themselves in a direction that's to them more favorable? And then I think you could deduce there, are they making constructive decisions in that direction or destructive decisions in that direction? But there is a truth to it. There is, as he mentions, a morale to it, right? It's almost a moral imperative, something that's embedded within us. Again, very inescapable. We start to see these recurring patterns in this work where these things that are impulsive to us and compulsive in many ways, if we have the free will to make choices in these directions, it seems to be that this is something that these natures to us are very inescapable. And also very paradoxical. I'm trying to even look through this and find any more parallels, any more patterns, and try to relieve us of some of this obscurity. He outlines this concept. He's really picking at this concept of the universe. So he's really looking at this from a bird's eye point of view, and he's trying to place principles and highlight principles that exist outside of the self. That the self is the one that's navigating decisions, that's navigating life, but there's something that exists, again, this elusive concept, this ethereal concept, this strangeness that we're almost chasing, and that chasing is what motivates us to act, even if the chasing in itself is strange, even if it relies on the notion of not having any meaning at all. And I think that's where this underlying paradox exists, right? Very interesting how we have this paradox where we believe in something, believe in a hero, believe in the characteristics of a hero, and that's what forces us to make decisions and move forward and develop our own character. But in that making the decision, what we're really following is a strangeness of those characteristics, and those strangeness seem to emulate an absurd world, an absurd life, almost an absurd feeling and universe of its own. And I think that this is kind of the again, that recurring loop that we find ourselves in when we're trying to chase, when we're trying to understand truth, when you start diving more into the philosophical principles, but even practically speaking, when you try to adhere to characteristics or even build up skills that you may not have yet. So it's fascinating. I want to talk about this vagueness a little bit, especially when referring again to this dichotomy between beauty and absurdity, where it seems like the vagueness actualizes emotions that are not understood when they arise from beauty or absurdity. So it's when you're being so vague about this, I guess when he's being so vague about these concepts, when you think of both beauty, when you think of absurdity, there are these emotions that actualize as a result, and that's how you're able to understand if it's coming from beauty or from absurdity, right? Again, that awestruck feeling, the emotion, if you may, that comes as a consequence from experiencing beauty is very different from the strangeness, that type of emotion, or the scarcity, if you may, that comes from absurdity, right? And this implies that beauty and absurdity, they both escape our comprehension, actually. They're both supposed to be undefinable in nature, but they arrive at very different realizations. So beauty is possibly the awe of acceptance of life, right? When you kind of have that awestruck feeling when experiencing beauty, there's an acceptance towards life. Again, in a very stoic approach, there's a sense of, oh, this, life has its own intelligence to it, and we must adhere to nature to live out our best selves, our highest truth, or the good life, as the ancient Greeks used to call it, right? But then when you experience absurdity, even if in its full vagueness, again, both are very vague, there's this actual tension of rejection that you feel. And I think this is where the dichotomy really starts to or continues to stem off, right? It's not defining beauty and absurdity. It's actually just highlighting the difference of what you feel and what those feelings and how those feelings resonate with your soul. And I think ultimately that plays a massive role in the actions you take and the perception you have of life at the end of the day. When you feel more acceptance, you can also feel more gratitude. You can also feel more openness. When you feel rejection, you feel this tension towards life. You feel very dismissive. You feel apprehensive about taking action, right? And it seems to be weird. We're always playing this game with ourselves, and this seems to be the dynamic between the beauty aspect of life and the absurdity of life. And not that we have to fear any one or the other, but understand them as fundamental pillars of life itself. And I hope that comes across. I hope that comes across quite clearly, because I think that is what the biggest takeaway, or one of the biggest takeaways we can get from that dichotomy is just think about it. When you're experiencing beauty and the acceptance you feel, you almost kind of relieve yourself. Even physiologically, you feel refreshed, you feel at ease when you're experiencing beauty. Whereas when you're feeling that sense of absurdity, while again not completely defined, but let's just talk about the strangeness of the soul without feelings, let's just start there at least. There's this rejection, there's this, you feel like you're in a void, you feel like, oh no, where do I go, where do I place my attention, because I don't have any immediate feedback, and there's a rejection to that. We need to, as humans, we're very prone to order. We like continuity. We like familiarity, and absurdity seems to sit right outside that boundary, just enough for us to sense it, to have an impulse toward it, but not enough to ever be able to define it. And of course, when you look at the grand theme of this work and Camus in general, it definitely begs the question is, okay, well, where is meaning? Is maybe perhaps you could make the claim that our meaning is is the inevitable and eternal chase towards the absurd, while realizing and accepting that you will never completely comprehend it. And maybe that is our hero's journey at the end of the day, right? It's understanding that feeling that it's this feeling that all true knowledge is actually impossible. And this is definitely quite the contradiction to Aristotle, who believed that everything in the universe was knowable. But maybe we do have this feeling that all true knowledge is impossible, and that scares us, and that provides us with the absurd. Maybe the absurd is actually just an emergent quality of the fact that we recognize that there's more unknown to life than known. And I think that feeling that provides us is absurd in nature, is very strange and obscure. So I will finish off here by just finishing off the last portion. We haven't gone too far in to the segment. However, I would like to close it off with some of his final words on this immediate topic, especially when referencing the difference between beauty and absurdity. So let me find where we are at here. Perfect. There is thus a lower key of feelings, inaccessible in the heart, but partially disclosed by the acts they imply and the attitudes of mind they assume. It is clear that in this way I am defining a method, but it is also evident that method is one of analysis and not of knowledge. For methods imply metaphysics. Unconsciously, they disclose conclusions that they often claim not to know yet. Similarly, the last pages of a book are already contained in the first pages. Such a link is inevitable. The method defined here acknowledges the feeling that all true knowledge is impossible. Solely appearances can be enumerated, and the climate make itself felt. Perhaps we shall be able to overtake that elusive feeling of absurdity in the different but closely related worlds of intelligence, the art of living, or of art itself. The climate of absurdity is in the beginning. The end is the absurd universe, and that attitude of mind which lights the world with its true colors to bring out the privileged and implacable visage which that attitude has discerned in it. My goodness. Again, just the writing, spectacular. And this is in the English translation. Could you believe that? His writings were initially in French, so my goodness, I can imagine the romantic articulation that that had come out initially, that had been described initially through his works. Wow, very very interesting. But as you can see, I had definitely jumped ahead before this when he mentions that feeling that all true knowledge is impossible, and he reiterates that or mentions that just in this last part of the passage here of Absurd Walls. It's very very cool to see him talk about this the temporal component, where I think because we view things very linearly, we think we think of things as a goal, and nihilism, absurdism, they aren't necessarily philosophical solutions, but pointing to philosophical problems. And when he mentions the absurd, it's not that you arrive at the absurd. It's not that you arrive in a linear fashion towards faith, for example. Let's say in a Kierkegaardian sense, you utilize your ration up to an extent and then you take your leap of faith. Instead, the absurd is inherently embedded within the beginning of your chapter, of your story, of your life, let's say of your heroism, and what it is that you embody. It's an all-encompassing and omnipresent essence, if you may. And this is what makes it so fascinating, is we don't know exactly where to place it. Where do we locate it? How do we know when we're experiencing the absurd? And it seems to be that Camus here is really just trying to find, and you'll see this in even before this passage, after this passage, if you have read this work, again, I definitely encourage you to do so. He is not completely yet defining the absurd. He is just finding different ways to articulate and highlight the absurd, just so it evokes enough of a feeling in you for you to understand what he's talking about. And when he talks about, like, for example, the end of the pages of a book are already contained in the beginning, it demonstrates that there's a characteristic to life, that the universe has its own character, that there's a storyline to the universe itself, and this absurdity is incumbent on our relationship to it. It's incumbent on us to try to understand whether or not we fully will understand or not. And I think what he's trying to say here is we'll realize that we won't be able to understand it, and that is what makes it absurd. And that could just be part of this meaning game we play with ourselves, that we can't escape from, but it's a worthwhile journey regardless, right? So it's interesting because there's an optimistic tone but also a pessimistic tone to this, and I think it all just really depends on the lens that you're looking at it through. But it's very cool. Again, I'll reiterate what he says here. The end is the absurd universe, and that attitude of mind which lights the world with its true colors to bring out the privileged and implacable visage which that attitude has discerned in it. So your attitude towards the absurd will be reflected back to you in the universe itself. And what's so cool about this, something I had just noticed, was when we look back at this dichotomy between beauty and absurdity, and if we do, let's say, somewhat define them as acceptance and rejection, you realize that he's talking about this concept of absurdity actually in the sense of actually coming from a standpoint of acceptance. So it's almost that when you accept the absurd is also accepting you, that it's bringing out its true colors. The universe is able to finally speak to you, is able to understand you, find meaning in you as well as you find meaning in it. And I think there's so many interpretations, and I am just very obsessed with coming up with some new ones here as well. Again, would love to know what you think. I think this is a brilliant work. I highly recommend, and it really makes us question the human condition as one of the more contemporary works in philosophy, and again, points to the problem of understanding meaning. And I would think we should even question, are we in a meaning crisis regardless? And I think there are so many different ways that we can approach this question. I think the faculties we have might not equip us to understand meaning the way we want it to. Similar to consciousness, we have this idea of consciousness, but everything that we try to do to describe consciousness just tends to approximate self-awareness, right? It's almost hard to decipher the difference between self-awareness and consciousness because of the elusive factor of consciousness. Same thing with meaning. Everything that we try to do to describe meaning will always come down to the story that we tell ourselves. It'll always come down to the meaning that we place on something. But again, we can't fully go the reductionist argument way, because we recognize that it's so elusive to us that we can't define it, that it's almost outside of our capabilities. And maybe that's part of the human condition. Again, is Sisyphus happy? His acceptance towards rolling that boulder up the hill over and over again. Is that the same story that kind of we're on when we're trying to discern the nature of the absurd, when we're trying to discern meaning in itself? And what's so cool about that is, if your goal to roll, again, just to play on that metaphor a little bit, if your goal is to roll the boulder up the hill and finally push it towards the other side, but you've developed an acceptance that it never will, what happens one day when it does roll to the other side? What if that happens? Will you actually feel more of that rejection, that tension, because it's now opposing your acceptance of the fact that it will just be an inevitable roll back down the hill? Again, it's almost the tables have turned on itself. And this is why I think it's very important for us to always have some optimism with our outlook of meaning. I think that things can definitely change with our perceptions. New information can always arise. But I do always believe, nonetheless, that we do need to question what meaning is to us and how we can develop different faculties, different languages to understand meaning. And I'm excited to see that one. So we'll talk to you on the next one. Hope you enjoyed that. Again, that was The Myth of Sisyphus. That was the section called Absurd Walls near the beginning of the book by Albert Camus. And we'll definitely see you on the next one. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much.